I guess let me just start by introducing Professor Abdullahi An-Na'im, or Abdullahi Ahmed An-Na'im, who I really have the pleasure to introduce as my compatriot countryman. I'm from Sudan too, and he's from Sudan. And we were of a generation that we went through a lot of struggles, and but I just want to highlight his own struggle, because Abdullah has been part of a group of activists who really engage with the issue of modernity, engage with the issue of Islam, and especially reform, what I've called even revolutionary reforms in Sudan. He was part of a larger group, if you will allow me to say this. It's known as the Republican Brothers, or the Republican Brotherhood. Has nothing to do with the Republicans in this country. That's a very important footnote or qualifier, because they're definitely engaged in activities that are very democratic, that engage in really in critical thinking about Islam. So that's really very important. You should read, since I mentioned this, the book that he translated and edited of a very famous theologian and a very important figure in the history of Sudan, and even globally. The book is called The Second Message of Islam, and Abdullah translated and gave a very good introduction. It was about it's a work that's written by a famous, the person I mentioned was executed in 1971 by a military government, and his name is Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, who really one of those people who tried to reform Islam, try to think about modern issues, from family law, women's rights, all of those things, and he really thought deeply about it. That's what made him very dangerous for even the Islamist movement, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, because he was far more progressive than them in being very daring in reforming Islam. I thought this is very important to say, because that tells you the background of Abdullahi Ahmed An-Na'im, who is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Law and Director of the Center for International and Comparative Law at Emory University School of Law. He's also Associated Professor in Emory College of Art and Science, Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, and he's also the author of so many books. He's really one of the foremost, most prolific, but he's also deep-thinking type of scholars that are engaged. So we should treasure this moment that he's here with us, braving all this terrible, weather rather than staying in Georgia. Although in Georgia they get scared about 1 inch. It's not; they can't even handle it. Anyway, so he's an author of his latest work, which is, I think, that's what the talk of yesterday was based on. And in fact, for some of you who are curious, we always record our talks in the ICL here, so you can get access to that if you are interested. We will put it online. He's also the author of Muslims and Global Justice, Islam and the Secular State, which is, I think, would be the base of his talk today, and it's actually an important contribution to the debate on the Islam and secularism, Islam and democracy, and all of those things. And another book, on Islamic Reformation, Civil Liberties and Human Rights. And I can go on and list so many honors and awards, and he has been an important figure in the whole debate. He's been invited to many keynote endowed lectures all over the world. One cannot count. But we really have the pleasure and the honor to host him here, and I want you to join me in welcoming Abdullah.
I take it the format is to start with a few remarks, and hopefully that you have read some of the book that we are talking about, Islam and the Secular State, so that as soon as we can have a conversation. I think my feeling is that we should have it really free-flowing and open talk about what we are collectively thinking about this. The idea of secularism and secular state is, of course, an old debate that Muslims have started having over almost the last 200 years in relation to the colonial and post-colonial experiences of those societies. And we, people like myself and Salah, coming into these conversations, we tended to engage the issues on the same vocabulary, the same sort of conceptual framing and structural understanding of what the issues are. And often as we get more taken into the conversation and engaging more, there comes a point when it is maybe useful to pause and reconsider whether we need to re-examine our assumptions, our language, definitions, terminology, and its implications. Language, of course, is a problem. It's always difficult to communicate with language. I mean, sometimes I say, I wish there was a way of communicating by sign language. But I'm sure that if we start doing that, we will soon discover or make problems for ourselves in communicating in sign language. Because the point, I think that I'm sure that you heard this and you work with this all the time, that any conversation is not only the speaker, it's the speaker and the audience, and it is a product of often preconceived notions of what the language that is being used and what it means and so on. So the term religion and the term secular and secularism are terms that people like myself have adopted and started working on in relation to Islam in very similar ways that they have been used and talked about in relation to Christianity or in relation to maybe other religious traditions. And I think that there is a need maybe to reconsider that. I will briefly introduce the core idea of Islam and the secular state, and then the debate that I have had with colleagues, with friends, and also in translations, because that text was translated into 8 languages of Muslim majority societies, and it's all on a website, open and accessible for the last 7-8 years. Free of charge, people can just download it anywhere. Farsi, Bengali, Urdu, Bahasa Indonesia, Russian, Turkish, French, Swahili, and Arabic. It's out in hard copy in Arabic and in Bahasa Indonesia. Now it's coming out in Chinese, I understand. So it will be read in all those languages. But I wonder to what extent the people who are going to read it in Chinese or the people who read it in Arabic and so on are really getting the meaning that I would have liked to communicate because of the language problem. The term secular and secularism is very problematic because it is associated with a notion of anti-religious or anti-religion. So the secular is not just simply a mode of life and consciousness and perception and so on, but it is an ideological position that is deliberately, explicitly anti-religious. That is the perception that Muslims have about secularism and the secular. And that's why many people have difficulty with the idea of a secular state or secularism as something that is applicable or can be practiced or experienced from an Islamic point of view. And I think it's obvious that Islam is not Christianity. The Muslim world is not Europe or North America or the North Atlantic region in which those terms were used and developed. And sometimes I begin to think even if the dichotomy between the secular and the religious, or the secular and the sacred, is really as meaningful in the Muslim context, or at least in the same way that it is meaningful in the Christian context. And maybe, so people try to, for example, in translating the book into Arabic, there was a debate that I had with colleagues about should it be the secular state or the civil state? Because as soon as you say secular state or secular anything, people shut off. There is really no, they are not listening exactly to what you are saying. They are already thinking you mean something else than what you think you mean, and so on. So we thought maybe the civil. But if you use the term civil state, you are going to have to define what you mean by that. And when you define it, you cannot really be sure that the people are using it in the way that you have defined, but rather in the way that they are used to the term. And so the difficulties continue. So in the title of the Arabic book, of the Arabic version of the book, is in fact something that I started with, also trying to. I don't want to give up the term secular, but I don't want to really immediately get into the distraction of this is European, this is Western, this is imperialist, and so on. So the term I use, al-Islam wa ilmaniyat al-dawla, which actually translated back into English would mean something like Islam and the secularity of the state. Because I wanted it to be clear that the secular in my mind applies to the state, not to society. So that I'm not talking about a secular society, I'm talking about a secular state. In fact, I speak of a secular state for the possibility of a Muslim society. So that is my thinking, is that, as I say in the opening sentence of Islam in the book, that I need, to be the Muslim I choose to be. I like to quote this phrase. I think it is a very precise way of capturing my intention and purpose in the whole project. To be the Muslim I choose to be by conviction and choice, which is the only way to be a Muslim. I need the state to be secular. By a secular state, I mean a state that is neutral regarding religious doctrine. So those are the first two sentences. So the point is that I'm not aware of people who are putting it in those terms, but I am putting it in this very, very categorical terms, that my call for a secular state is not a call for reconciling Islam or Muslim theology or anything with something called a secular state. It is a claim that I need the state to be secular for the possibility of being Muslim. In other words, that the secular nature of the state is prerequisite for the possibility of religious belief as a Muslim. An aspect of this is to say that, you see, the belief, religious belief, logically requires the possibility of disbelief. That is, if I cannot disbelieve, I cannot believe either. So, it is critical for the possibility of genuine religious belief that society is organized in such a way that this belief is possible. And in fact, accepted completely without any, because I mean, the more problems you have in disbelieving, the less likely will your religious belief be genuine and transformative as it should be. So that is the logic that I'm trying to invoke here. Now, part of the trying to investigate whether I use the right way to communicate and whether what I am trying to communicate is in fact being communicated, whether people have any problems with it or not. In this next project that I mentioned in the, maybe it was mentioned to you as for this seminar, looking to see whether there is a way of, and I don't know yet how, but if there is a way of finding out how Muslims feel about the state. Because as soon as we inject language like secular state, secularism, even democracy, and any of that, we are, I think, already constraining the discourse on terms that we can comprehend, but may not really be that meaningful for the communities that we are trying to work with. our communities or other communities. So in other words, that if there is a way of trying to find out how people feel about the state, what does the state mean to them? But before we try to begin to analyze, so if that is the state as they see it, what does that mean for our discourse about secular, about democracy or democratization, about constitutionalism? Before we get to that, if you can find out how people feel about it, how of course, it's not going to be completely free of the jargon and the sort of the confusion that comes with the language that we use, because already that language sort of infiltrated into the public discourse of these societies in the colonial and pre-colonial and post-colonial experiences that they had. But at least to the extent that we can find out how people feel about these issues. And see them, how they would frame those questions for themselves and so on. Often when I talk about Islam and the secular state, or the idea that, my claim is radical, I don't know if you've got to see it. My claim is that there is no such thing as an Islamic state. There never has been, there never can be. It is not that an Islamic state is not good or is not or is authoritarian or this and that. That it is a total incoherence. It's a contradiction in terms. The idea of the state being Islamic is untenable logically, conceptually, because there is no measure of Islamicity for the state to be. When you say Islamic this, Islamic that, I mean, this, of course, in people who travel in Muslim regions, you will see this. I mean, everything is, for a time at least, I hope not for long now, you get, everything is Islamic this, Islamic that. You know, I remember going through Cairo and see Al-Maqsar al-Islamiyya, Al-Malham al-Islamiyya. Everything is Islamiyya, Islamic. You know, like the terms I just used now, the Islamic laundry, the Islamic butchery. Is it butchery, Malhama?
Yeah.
The Islamic Hududi, the Islamic Makhudi. Everything Islamic. What is it? What is this Islamic? What is the quality by which we judge if something is or is not Islamic? How do we know? There is no agreement, there is no measurable standard of, like, what are the boxes that you tick to say, okay, so I have a claim that Iran is an Islamic republic. Okay, what does that mean? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you think, no, it is 20% Islamic, or no, 40% Islamic. There is no way of judging. But the more important, the more serious problem is that there is no possibility of judging except through a human institution. That, even assuming that we have a criteria for judging what is Islamic, the only way that it can be judged is by a human person. Who is that person? How did he or she get to be in that position? There is no way that it can be without politics. So the incoherence of the concept of an Islamic state is in the fact that the quality of being Islamic can only ultimately be judged by human beings acting politically. And therefore, ultimately, it cannot be sacred. It cannot be so-called divine, because it's going to be ultimately human judgment. Even assuming that it is the best of possible human judgment, neutral human judgment, if that can be possible, unbiased and all of that, but still it's going to be a person, and as such a fallible person who he could get it right, got it wrong. And so when you look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, this so-called the supreme leader is constitutionally the authority that is above the constitution in defining and accepting or approving what is and what is not Islamic. How did he get to be there? Through politics, of course. Who is he? is he infallible? Is he sort of immune from error, as the Shia believe the Imam to be? Because nobody claims that he is the Imam. Khomeini may have had the illusion that he was going to be the Imam, but he died, and now we know he is not the Imam. So the Imam that is for the Shia is this sort of trans-historical figure that is the embodiment of religion. And of course there are certain difficulties with the fact that the Imam disappeared for the Shia, for the 12s of Shia in 874 when he was a child. And so if he died, then the Shia have been living without an Imam for the last 1,000 years. But if he's alive, where is he? What is he doing? When is he going to come back? So those types of questions exist, but that is not the point here, because the supreme leader does not claim to be the Imam. So he's a fallible human being who got to be in that position politically, and he can lose it politically. So how can he be in a position to judge the Islamic quality of the state? Another aspect that is also, I'm talking a bit more than I intended, but maybe these ideas need to be clarified or at least put on the table. Sharia cannot be state law. Not that it should not, but it cannot be state law. A norm of Sharia ceases to be Sharia by the very act of enacting it as state law, because it becomes the political will of the state and not the religious norm of Islam. For a Sharia norm to be implemented or lived by or applied, if you like, in a way that is religiously significant and valuable, it has to be done voluntarily, with the deliberate intention to comply. That is, an act, to steal, for example, is a crime, and to steal is sin. To steal is a crime, and to steal is a sin. But it is not a sin because it's a crime, and it's not a crime because it's a sin. That is the criteria and the way by which a religious sort of quality is attached to a conduct is different from the way a legal consequence is attached to a conduct. And the nature of religious authority is different. The nature of the religious reasoning and the sources by which conduct is classified or clarified as this or the other is different from the political. So therefore, mixing the two will create a situation where a secular act remains a secular act, except it is called a sacred act. Calling it a sacred act does not make it sacred, if the way by which it came to be is not sacred in the first place. So, if you like, we can talk more about this idea. But my point is that deliberate intention to comply, in Arabic it's called niyya. Al-niyya means the intent to comply, is prerequisite for every single religious act to be religious. So if I happen to not eat or drink for 24 hours or for 12 hours or a full day, and so that does not mean that I'm fasting unless I intended to fast beforehand. If I just happen not to eat and drink, then that's just simply that I spent a day without eating or drinking, but it is not the religious act of fasting, and so on. So the point also is that there is no agreement of what Sharia is on any issue, not only empirically but conceptually too. By that I mean, what Sharia is always what a human person thinks it is. It is never what God intended immediately from the revelation to human experience, except through human agency. That it is always going to be a human person's understanding of what Sharia is. And this was clear to Muslim scholars from the beginning. So they always said that knowledge of Sharia in fact, one point to them is that Sharia is unknowable. You cannot know what Sharia is. You can only guess. So the Arabic term they used is zanni, meaning that knowledge of Sharia is suppositional. Everybody who said anything about Sharia from the day the Prophet died until today, all he's saying is that I think Sharia is on this point, is this way or that way. It is never Sharia itself is this or the other. And this is what is new about the post-colonial Islamist discourse, is that they dispensed with that profound doubt that Muslim scholars always were very keen to feel and to in themselves and to express as a caveat to what they have to say. Because they will always start by saying that, reviewing the evidence, and then they will conclude by saying, Wallahu a'lam. God knows best. And always they also say that this is my view and God knows best. So they were very conscious of the fact that it is nothing more than their view. That's why Muslim scholars have from the very beginning resisted any codification of their views. And in fact, some of them were tortured and pressured, imprisoned by caliphs who wanted to enact their views as the law of the land, and they refused and they resisted. They would rather go to prison than allow their views to be enacted as state law. So that's why we never had codification of Sharia until the Ottoman Majalla in the mid-19th century. And that was extremely partial. It was codification of parts of the Hanafi school regarding obligations, transactions and obligations, but not the totality of Sharia. Because there are so many views on every issue, and that every view is legitimate for those who believe in it, that you cannot choose any issue and make it the law of the land for everybody else. So those are the sort of reasons I use to argue that Sharia cannot be state law. So the project of the Islamists should be attacked at its core by saying that the concept of an Islamic state is incoherent, is unprecedented, is practically impossible. And we can see all of that, how it is. And that the idea of making Sharia a state law itself is a total fallacy. In fact, it contradicts the very nature of Sharia. Okay, I think that most Muslims, if they were really to debate the question freely and openly, they would come to similar conclusions if the points are made in that way. But I would like to know what they do think anyway, and try to find out. So I look at Senegal, I look at both both India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran. I'm trying to find scholars who would be social scientists, who can find out how people think and what is the public discourse and popular discourse about all these questions. Trying to see if there is a way to get to what I'm trying to say without getting sort of entangled into all that sort of European historical sort of thinking and philosophical, conceptual thinking. I would rather, if I wish I could communicate and converse with Muslims about their views of the state and what it should be like in indigenous terms, or at least non sort of European terms, if we can. So those are some thoughts. I know it is not. I don't know how far. Already I've spoken for almost half an hour. So
It's okay. You have.
yeah.
You're fine.
So better maybe I can react to what you think and any questions that you have, and in that way try to clarify what I'm saying.
Well, thank you, and well done. The ball is in your court. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really a profound set of remarks. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the relationship between religious clerics and the state traditionally within the Islamic world, because I'm also very struck by the contrast between this idea of profound doubt and kind of extreme pluralism within kind of traditional Islamic study, that everyone, you know, understands that they're only espousing their view and everyone else potentially has a claim to a different view or a different interpretation on the one hand, and the sort of absolutist, you know, idea of Islam that certainly circulates in the West, but also, according to you, is a product of what you call post-colonial Islamic discourse. So, if the Islamic State is paradoxical, going back to the pre-colonial world, what was the relationship then between the caliphs, the secular authorities or the non-religious authorities of the you know, political organizations or territories at that time, and the clerics? So there certainly was an aspiration for the caliphs to act according to Islamic interpretation. So how could you avoid, in some way, enacting Islamic or enacting Sharia? I mean, how would you actually avoid that if your aspiration as a caliph or as a head of state is to rule Islamically?
The aspiration of rulers was political expediency and legitimacy. That included a dimension of religious validity and discourse, but it was not going to be at the expense of their own political rationale and reasons. So the relationship between, the term actually, it is the ulama and the fuqaha, which rhymes, between the scholars and the rulers, sorry, between the ulama and the umara, or the fuqaha and the umara. Umara means princes, and the fuqaha means the scholars of Sharia, was a dance. Because throughout Muslim history, pre-colonial, the fuqaha were never incorporated into the state. Except very late in the Ottoman Empire, when the notion of the mufti as an administrative institution was established, to hire actually and pay certain scholars as the scholars of the state. But that did not necessarily mean that they were the scholars that the communities took seriously and accepted. So people would live with what those scholars say because the state says so, not because they are convinced that what the scholars are saying is right or correct. But the historical relationship was a relationship between scholars who gain authority and following among their in their communities through their own knowledge and piety. So the fact that they know the sources and they can make very elaborate and clear exposition of the positions, and that in their own lifestyle were pious believers. So that is how they formed their following. So when you look at the Sunni schools or the Shia schools for that matter, and how they formed around figures of brilliant scholars. None of them was ever within the state institutions or took a state position. And when I said it was a dance, in that the princes, the rulers, tried to co-opt the religious endorsement of the scholars without allowing the scholars to control the state. And the scholars wanted the political support of the rulers for their views to stand a chance of practical application, but were always very keen not to be seen to be co-opted by the state. And it was in the interest of the state that the scholars be seen to be autonomous. Because the ability of the scholars to legitimize what the state is doing is dependent on the autonomy of the scholars from the state. So the rulers had a vested interest in maintaining the autonomy of the scholars, or at least not interfering with it too much, because that would mean that they will lose the legitimizing value of the scholars endorsing what they do. So it was supposed to be a relationship where the scholars are independent, but as independent scholars, they would express views that support what the state is doing, and in that way the state gains legitimacy among the following and so on. The relationship also was practically also community-based and autonomous by choice, meaning that in the major cities, as the state developed further and became more complex and more included other civilizations, other, especially the Persian system of administration and the Roman law factors that came into various regions of the Muslim empire, that the caliphs started appointing judges, but they were not judges who had binding jurisdiction over territory or population. They were just simply available to people, and the people choose the judge they go to. So there is a very useful book that I can recommend to you, which goes through the Mamluk period in Egypt, explaining the nature of the relationship between the judges that the state appointed and the people, and another group that's called the muftis, who were and it was very interesting because this was a very advanced stage in that the muftis were scholars of Sharia who would express a view about a case in abstract terms. So what happens is that litigants will choose a judge to go to. That is the point to be made categorically, is that at no point throughout Muslim history before the colonial period were people obliged to go to a particular judge by virtue of the fact that they live in this district and so on. It's always that they choose the judge they go to. And the state would appoint judges who will be available for people to come to, but have no way of controlling who is going to go to which judge. So, for example, the Mamluks appointed 4 judges in Cairo. One was a Maliki, one was a Hanafi, one was a Hanbali, the 4 schools. And it was the litigants who choose which judge to go to. And when they do, the judge would not adjudicate the case immediately on his own knowledge, but he will put the case to a mufti, but almost like a retracted fashion. He will frame the question as a legal question. If someone bought something and paid this much for it, but that was this and that and so on, what would be the outcome or solution, or the nature of the transaction? And then the mufti will express the view. He will say that in a case where this and this and that happened, the outcome should be this. But if that had happened, the outcome would have been that. This will go back to the judge, and the judge will rule accordingly among the people. But the critical point for me to emphasize is that there was no way that there was a judge who can bring you to the jurisdiction of the court, except the secular judges, like the muhtasib, for example, or the tax judges. So there were state officials whose function was straightforward secular state functions, collecting taxes, controlling weights and measures in the market, controlling quality of goods that are these are the functions of the muhtasib. But the muhtasib was a state official, and he has coercive jurisdiction over people, but not otherwise. So that was the nature of it. So it was there was no centralized administration of justice. There was no function of public prosecution. No function of public prosecution. The state did not prosecute cases. Litigants, for example, if there is a complaint of a rape or complaint of a theft, it is the litigants who will take the case to a judge of their choice. And then the judge will look for legal opinion if he needed to get that in the major cities, and then he would rule on the case. the state may step in to enforce a judgment of a judge after the fact, but not to before the fact determine what the law is for which judge to apply.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah. It's fascinating because it is sort of the polar opposite from the Western tradition of the evolution of the state, which kind of begins with a very absolutist notion. So there's sort of Hobbesian notion of the Leviathan, and it's only gradually that you get ideas of democracy that emerge.
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of beginnings of the modern state in the 1600s are really, in the West, are very opposite of what you're expressing.
Yes.
Which is fascinating, I think.
And I think really we lose a lot by not trying to redeem or retrieve that pre-colonial ways of thinking. We were talking last night about this in relation to the African setting in which this is something I call retrieving the irretrievable and imagining the unimaginable, which is how things might have been had it not been for the colonial intrusion. Despite the fact that the colonial intrusion did in fact happen so much that it affected or it affects the way we see and find things to retrieve. That is, say I'm an African trying to reach back into a pre-colonial administration of justice in Sudan, the Nile Valley, say in the 17th century or 16th century. The problem is that as myself a product of colonial education and colonial influences, here I am talking to you in this place, cold place, in English, and so on. Already, I'm no longer the sort of the pure subject that, or if there is such a thing as a pure subject, that I might have been to be able to retrieve that which was pre-colonial without being tainted by colonial sort of experience. But because, so it is. There's a factor of impossibility of imagining how things might have come to be and retrieving what might be relevant to those situations. And yet, that is the effort that we have to do. So it is not to say that, to acknowledge the difficulty of it and the complexity of it, contingency of it, is still not to say that so we shouldn't try to do it, but to say to do it with the least possible distortion. So I think it's more about if we can tap values, tap ways of thinking and so on, that can help us indigenize and root our post-colonial experiences into pre-colonial value systems and relationships and so on.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for your talk today and yesterday, and I apologize, I haven't read your book. It's sitting in a stack in my office somewhere. But so I appreciate kind of the first principle, kind of the core principle in the argument that there can be no compulsion in religion, so the state, I can only be a Muslim when I'm not being commanded to do the right and the state isn't forbidding the wrong. But maybe it's because of this earlier question, I have, states still need to do things, right, in the modern world. States still need to collect taxes. States provide a basket of public goods, and that basket changes over time, and the community needs to come to a consensus on what is in that basket of things. The social safety net, defense of the country, how you're going to pay for that, how you're going to mobilize that. So there are things a state still needs to do, and maybe it's because of this previous question. I have Noah Feldman's little book in my mind about the rise and fall of the Islamic State, and thinking of the implications of what you've said for constitutional design, the structures we would have. I mean, Feldman's argument in a nutshell is basically that you say in the Constitution that Islamic law is or the principle or the fixed elements, however you want to word it. We know that what you say in the Constitution doesn't really matter that much in terms of what the output of policy is. But then you have an elected parliament that makes laws, but that can err, that can make mistakes, and do things that are contrary to God's law. So what you do is you have some sort of panel of experts or constitutional review court or something. And this is where people come in, right? That's where the subjectivity of what exactly Sharia entails comes in. But all that seems very consistent with the arguments you were making, once you get past those first principles of no compulsion in religion.
No, but who is to say that the outcome is a Sharia outcome at all?
So there's two ways to respond. One is that you'll never actually achieve, you'll never have full certainty that's what it is. So it's some sort of consensus of the scholars, and who is the scholars is a political process. It's part of a political output. Who's on these review committees?
Yeah.
That's what politics in Egypt is about today. That's what politics in Iraq is about. Who's on the constitutional review courts? That's politics. Who gets appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Fine, but don't call it Sharia. Call it politics. What it is. My problem is Feldman sort of analysis or the claim of the Islamists, and they are not very different actually.
Yeah.
Is that I don't see where the imperative to call it Sharia comes from, and where is any indication of the true Sharia quality of the outcome can be assured. So it is when you say the state has to do things, absolutely the state has to do things, and go ahead and do them. And we try to be as democratic as we can in holding the state accountable and in trying to influence what the state will do in our name and all that. Fine, but this is politics, this is secular government. So the state is secular. And whatever the state does is secular. It cannot be religious. Neither the state as an institution nor the outcome of its conduct. So let all of this go ahead. And in fact, it has been going ahead all along. It never changed, and it will not change. Go ahead. What is new is trying to call what we already know to be politics and secular governance, calling it Sharia outcomes. And the danger of that is that once you call it Sharia and accept the claim, then you cannot change it, you cannot do anything about it, because that will be heresy, which is a crime punishable by death. So let the state do what the state do. Let parliaments do. And so when you say that council, this notion of repugnancy notion, which is in Pakistan constitutionally, that you have this panel of scholars, who are they? How did they get to be there in the first place? They were selected by the state. Yeah. So it is the state who decides who sits on that panel. And that panel may not be representative or reflect of the views and the positions of the vast majority of the population about what Sharia is. Yet, what they say what Sharia is supposed to override what the elected institution of the state may say the law should be. So I think the confusion comes when it is nonsense, of course. I mean, that clause about Islam being the religion of the state is nonsense. And totally incoherent, and the state cannot have a religion. And why do you call it that? What does that mean? Because think of not only Shias, Muslims in Sunni states or Sunni Muslim Shia states, to them, what the state is identifying as Sharia is not Sharia at all. In fact, it's total heresy. I mean, for the Shia of Iraq, of Saudi Arabia, the eastern region of Saudi Arabia, what the Wahhabi state is doing is actually heretical. And yet they are supposed to obey it as Islam, not as just simply state administration. So not only that, but even between Sunni and Malikis, or between Hanafi and Hanbalis. So differences, even within the same school, you can have a view, and these questions can be extremely serious. You may be aware of the Nigerian case of Amin al-Awal and others who were sentenced to death on a Maliki doctrine that accepts circumstantial evidence as proof of that is like pregnancy, as proof of zina. Whereas to the three other Sunni schools, zina can only be proved by either confession or four witnesses to the actual act of intercourse.
Like if zina is just not...
Zina is extramarital sexual relations.
Not just witness. Some scholars say you got to run a string between the two bodies.
Exactly. So they are extremely. That's why there has never been a conviction of zina except through confession throughout Muslim history until we have this recent sort of flair of enacting fornication statutes and so on, and enforcing them like so. So the difference is so serious that to accuse a woman of zina based on the fact that she was pregnant without being married is a capital crime punishable by death for the woman in a Maliki jurisdiction or a place where the Maliki school prevails, or it would be the other capital crime of qasf, which is unproved accusation of zina, in any other place where the Maliki school does not prevail. So even so, which is Sharia?
So if I could follow up, I agree completely with that, and there's this larger point that you'll never actually know. But what I heard you say, which I think is kind of the real key conjecture, is that the reason this isn't just a rhetorical distinction, calling it Sharia or calling it, I don't know, freedom, whatever. Is that by calling it Sharia, once a decision is made on something, it's extremely hard to deviate away from that.
Yeah.
It endows it with some sort, in one particular group's understanding of something. And unlike, say, the U.S. Constitution, which there's battles over, but it does change over time, there is a reinterpretation of certain things, unless you're and you can actually rewrite things, you can change things, you can amend it. And the problem with calling it a religious state is that once a decision is made, and that decision is made through a political process, that prevents certain trajectories in the future.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly my worry. And I'm from Sudan. We live with this. I've been living with this for the last 30 years. Since 1983, when Emory overnight enacted those so-called September laws, enacting 9 statutes in one single act, transformed the Sudanese law totally. And you see it happening in Pakistan. You see that Pakistan was not started as an Islamic state. It was defined as an Islamic state later, in the 1950s. And then elements of what does that mean seeped into the constitution over time, until you come to the point that when the Zina ordinance and so on were enacted by Zia in the mid-1970s, they became irreversible. So in the same way that the Sharia, the September laws in Sudan became irreversible, of course they are reversible, they should have been reversed, because they have nothing to do with Sharia to begin with. But no politician will do it. But someone like me, I will do it in a flash. Because I have no inhibition about it, because I know it is not Sharia. And I stand to account for this. See, I think one element maybe that is probably very hard to bring to people in this sort of place is that for me, these issues are not only just simply political and fundamental struggles that I have, but also this is about my eternal salvation. That I am a Muslim, and I believe that literally that I'm accountable personally, individually, for what I say or for what I fail to say. And therefore, if I say something that this is nonsense, this is not Sharia, and it is Sharia, I know I will go to hell for it. I don't know exactly what that means, but something like that. But now, how do you counter this into an academic discussion about an Islamic state? Except to bring this awareness that this is not just simple. I did say this in the book that you haven't read yet, Islam and the Secular State. I think I said it in the preface, and I said in the preface in which I say that where I say that this is my ultimate position. This is the position for which I stand accountable before God. I don't think that Noah Feldman had anything of that nature in his mind when I talked about the rise and fall of Sharia state or an Islamic state. But the point is to say that for Muslims, at least for believers who take it personally as a matter of personal belief and accountability, is that the issues are fundamental, and therefore it is not only the injustice and the horrendous cruelty of inflicting those punishments on women and never on men, and all that can be said legitimately and correctly, but also that there is it's a lie, but it's a lie that once uttered and believed, it's very difficult to take it back.
Go ahead, sorry.
Kind of going off what Professor Patel was just talking about, I think what you're saying is that once you call it Sharia, the law itself takes on this divine, infallible aspect, much like You talked about pharaohs of Egypt who you couldn't speak out against, and the fact that there is humanity involved in its creation automatically says it can't be Sharia. But if I read your book correctly, Sharia is meant to be personally interpreted as an individual Muslim and voluntary, as you said. So I kind of want to bring in the question of, because we've talked about it in class, the compatibility of Islamic democracy. And looking at a state like Egypt, where Islam is such a critical part of their culture. And the ability to take something like Sharia, but almost call it what it is, and not Sharia, but using things like shura and ijtihad, and essentially using those personal interpretations of Sharia and what each individual person thinks it is, and consulting the people, consulting the scholars, whatever they decide is best, and creating a constitutional document out of that, where it's almost an Islamic state in that it's based on Sharia, but you don't call it Sharia and you understand what it is, that it is a fallible set of documents that is the people of Egypt's, best attempt at Sharia. Is that something that's incompatible with what you're saying, or is that something that you could see as a secular state that is compatible with Islam?
To me, a state is secular, period. The state has nothing to do with religion. The state is a political institution that has vital functions, that we need it to perform those functions, but that's it. The vast rest of life is outside the state. The state is not really, is extremely important, and it is critical at this point, the way that we are politically organized and economically organized and so on, but it is just an institution that performs certain functions. Don't confuse those functions with other aspects of our consciousness, our religious and spiritual and moral life, which we have outside the state. So, this country, some people will think that's a Christian country, or at least definitely closer to its founding, it was identified as a Christian country, but it developed a constitution and a system of laws and administration and federalism and all of that, which is guided, inspired, informed by the religious values and cultures of the people who live here, and hopefully will continue to do that, reflecting other values and religions than the so-called founders. Okay, that's fine. That is, I don't think that any society will organize itself politically and constitutionally and legally in ways that are in contradiction with its fundamental values. But so long as we are aware that we are reflecting those values into a political institution that has its own very specific nature and function. But as soon as you bring the word Sharia or Islamic into the conversation, you're confusing the issues. Because, I mean, not only for the Copts, for example, of Egypt, who have nothing to do with Islam. I mean, why? It's ironic, really. I mean, the Copts were not coerced into conversion to Islam in Egypt. They remained Copts for 300 years after Muslim conquest. And they gradually started, so Egypt became more and more Islamic and less Coptic over many centuries, and by the factors of cultural influence and so on. The Fatimids who ruled Egypt for some time had a little coercive dimension around the 11th century or so. But otherwise, you see, so Copts have lived in Egypt for throughout the time since Islam came to Egypt in 638 without any problem, seriously. I mean, they were acknowledged as a minority who were required to pay a certain tax and so on. But this was the pre-colonial, which was a very ancient history. But the point I'm making is that as soon as you start talking about an Islamic state or Article 2 of the Egyptian Constitution, what about the Copts? They are equal citizens of the country. Why should their religious identity not be reflected in the Constitution? And there is a thing about Muhammad too, or Muhammad al-Batal?
No. You feel Patel?
But,
He's a professor.
Because I thought because Batal is
Hero.
Patel.
But this as a
You can call me
combination.
It's actually closer to Indian. Patel.
Yeah.
So sorry, but the thing is that the every society will continue to struggle to reflect its values in its legal and constitutional and other sort of aspects of its organizing its public life, its economic life, and so on, which is fine and which is going on everywhere, and people will struggle with that. But I don't see why you have to invoke the name of Islam or Sharia, except to confuse the issues. And the reason I am so opposed to Sharia and Islam being brought into the picture is precisely why people who invoke it want to have it for. Meaning, the people who want to bring in Sharia and Islam seek to sanctify and insulate what they do politically against challenge and contestation. That is the only reason they use it. So that what we do is Islam. How dare you oppose what we do? So that's exactly why I'm opposed to it. So to say that what you do is at best is what you think Islam would have you do, but it is nothing more than that. And therefore calling it Islamic is going to confuse the issue and make it difficult for me to challenge what you do, which is political, not religious. Does that make sense?
Oh, Aziz? Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess I have a question that maybe follows up on this, which is, I'm curious about how deep you think the paradox of the Islamic State goes, and the worry, let's say, for me is the problem of political quiescence. So, you could make an argument that, in a way, that if we think of religion as something that's supposed to be purely voluntary, that should even affect how social movements or various groups conceive of their own political projects. So this is maybe an issue of public reason. That if you take some of the most valued, say, social movements in the US, abolitionism, the civil rights movement, these were movements that emerged out of the church. And they very consciously made arguments that were religious, that were tied to claims about higher law, that were precisely meant to sanctify political views through the language of religion, and to make claims that were supposed to be beyond popular dispute. Now, it's not just religious actors or religious language that does this. It's Marxists use determinist language about history, that history requires the victory of the working class, but Martin Luther King talks about civil disobedience in support of a higher law that's supposed to be committed to racial equality. Now, I guess the thought is that if you believe that there's a fundamental paradox that says that religious language is really not about compulsion, but it's about individual choice, then how should we think of how people ordinarily construct their arguments? That it's not really clear that folks separate between public and private, and oftentimes the most powerful languages that individuals have, the way that they make claims on the state, is precisely through religious or ideological language. So I guess it seems to me that clearly defining something as one sphere is secular and the other is religious, and separating between private faith and public reason doesn't actually follow how many of the changes that we're most proud of have actually been pursued. And it's been by using religious language to make claims on the state and to impose a form of compulsion.
I don't think it's a form of compulsion. It's a form of persuasion. It's not compulsion. It is persuasion. And I think that the confusion comes maybe in thinking that that's the point I said briefly last night, that the distinction between religion and the state, or the presumably separation of religion and the state, is not the same as religion and politics. In my view, religion and politics cannot and should not be separated. You can't control why people vote the way they do. And so for those people whose choice of for whom to vote for is influenced by their religious conviction, as they might be influenced by other factors also, that we don't know what that is, and we can't control it, and we should not try to control it. So I think that the U.S. Constitution, the amendment tries to distinguish or separate between religion and the state, yes, but not religion and politics. It did not claim that, and I don't think that U.S. history is a history of separation of religion and politics. Today, as it has always been, religion is extremely influential politically. And the political leaders would not dare do something that would be disapproved of religiously, simply because people will turn away from them and will vote for someone else. So the fact, all the symbolism that we use in our political discourse and so on. So now the other aspect of my response would be that I think when I said that Islam is not Christianity and the Muslim world is not Europe or the North Atlantic, I'm hinting at the need to reconsider all type of, the so-called distinction between the public and the private. And so the fact that we speak of Islam as if we speak of Christianity is a problem for me. The notion that the meaning of the secular for Muslims is not the same, I think, as the meaning of secular for Christians. So these dichotomies and concepts and so on, frameworks, have been developed in the Christian context, reflecting a particular theological, intellectual history, which is absolutely fine for those societies with those histories and those contexts, but should not necessarily be assumed to apply elsewhere. I'm not yet in a position to say what should we keep or should we dispense with this or the other and how, but I'm raising the question that we should consider seriously whether that should happen or not. Now there is another aspect which is also problematic is that in the post-colonial African, primarily what I'm thinking of, but would be broader, there's a fundamental ambivalence about the state and how to talk about the state and so on. Because there are two dimensions to it. So the state as a territorial so-called nation state has been imposed on us through the colonial experience, and it is an alien institution that we are struggling to come to terms with and to know what to do with and so on. And in that respect, all the convulsions and struggles that you see in Africa are not unusual for any community trying to come to terms with such a fundamental radical political shift in the political organization and so on. So we're trying we're struggling with that, but at the same time trying to do so in a way that is true to to the true nature of who we are. So the claim of self-determination is not just simply a claim of political independence, but it's a claim about the self and determination and how the two are connected. So that, I take it to say, there is a book that Akil Pulkrani is editing, in which I contributed a chapter about Ustaz Mahmoud and his work in relation to this question of what I call self-liberation as opposed to self-determination. That self-determination is a political doctrine that seeks to enable very conventional independence from colonial political control, in the sense of physical colonial control. But colonialism is a state of mind more than it is a state of physical occupation. So our minds remain colonized, although our lands presumably are no longer physically occupied. And until we declare our epistemological independence from European methodological and epistemological premises and presuppositions, we have not even started our true process of self-liberation. So that is the argument I'm making. But at the same time, So someone like me, I think, trying to bring this notion of retrieving the irretrievable and getting back to some roots that precede colonialism, but doing it through the reality of the colonial experience, including the state. So I have to deal with the European model of the state in trying to declare my independence of European epistemological dominance. So that is a paradox. And therefore, I think that when I say, so the fact that we keep these European ideas of the state seem to indicate notions of public and private, distinction between public and private and this and that, and public reason, and those types of languages and terminologies that we use seem to be indicated by the fact that we have European nation states throughout the continent, where in fact we have declared very early on that we are not going to disrupt any of this. We are going to accept and work with, the Organization of African Unity 63 made it very clear that we will keep the boundaries and keep the state as we have it. But I think I say, okay, we had to do this, but now we should be at a point of immaturity or of maturity that we are willing to begin to open up these concepts and ideas and to reconsider them. And maybe they don't apply to us. I don't know whether or not they should and how they should apply if they do. But I think the very idea that we should open them up and not take them for granted that this is the way it has to be is an important step that we should start taking at least.
Anybody from? Go ahead.
Kind of.
You want to say? Okay.
He knows, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
We were talking about it a little bit in class on Tuesday, but I found your arguments very rational, and so then I was wondering how, and you mentioned like the Muslim Brotherhood early on in your book, I was wondering how a group like that would respond to the arguments that you make in your book, or if they would even be able to generate a response of like if Sharia is like kind of like an individual, or based on an individual interpretation, if they even have a concept of Sharia for like the group at large that they all accept or say they accept.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think what actually we have seen in Egypt recently, both in terms of not only the overthrow of Mubarak, but the way that the constitution was adopted and elections were organized and the Muslim Brothers won by not that really devastating margin as some people were expecting. I mean, some observers of the region were expecting the Muslim Brotherhood to win with such a massive margin that in fact it was much smaller than, and there were many other factors that the process of election and organizing and so on has brought out to the surface that shows that ideology is not really that decisive. I mean, there are many other factors that are at play. But in any case, and then you get the backlash. And also that how people started coming to the square again and protesting, and then the army, you have this creeping coup that took place, and now Morsi is facing trial. It's just really amazing. We have a president who was overthrown, who's still awaiting trial. Before his trial was over, we have another president who was elected, and now he is under on trial for crimes he committed while he was president, according to the constitution that was adopted. And now I think before long, maybe we'll have this new guy also on trial. So we may have 3 Egyptian presidents on trial at the same time. So it is a very confused, but I think it reflects the ambivalence of the population at large about these questions. On the one hand, there are many who are totally taken by the Sharia and Islamic State and that discourse, that they are willing to vote for the Muslim Brother. But there are some who were disillusioned very quickly and began to see how dangerous that discourse is, and therefore were willing to come out on the streets again demanding the removal of Morsi. So my point is that I'm not really expecting or keen on the Muslim Brotherhood as such accepting what I'm saying. I'm rather hopeful that the population at large who are misled by or confused by Muslim brothers' discourse will see the point I'm making and take a different position. So my target audience is not the hardcore Islamist, because I mean to them, like all ideologues, I mean the issues are so clear and categorical that they are not willing to say anything else. But it is rather their following. It is the people whom they influence. If I could influence them otherwise, or people like me and others influencing them otherwise, then that is the objective that we can hope for. I think it's always going to be clumsy and disorganized and indecisive. I mean, you know, what is the right thing to do? Is it this right or wrong? What is the best way for us to organize our future? All these are very difficult questions that all societies struggle with indefinitely. There is never going to be a time when we are categorically clear on this and everything else. But we given what we have to work with, I think this is an important contribution to make if it can reach the right people to influence the way they think. Now, this book has been published in Egypt and is being read, and from time to time I hear about people talking about it, the occasional op-ed piece that come in newspapers or so on. But I don't know if we, in places like this, exaggerate our importance and our influence. You know, that we tend to think that if I write a book, something is going to happen. I don't know. Maybe my hope is that when people start questioning, I hope this to be really at hand for them to look at and trying to come to some sort of answers. But not to expect people just to sort of read it, like buy it at airports and read it on the plane, and by the time they get to the other place they change their mind about everything. I don't know if that responds. So basically my audience is the population at large, not the hardcore leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So if the population at large, I guess, had a change of heart, what would the first steps in implementing a secular state look like?
It is really, I guess you are Sudanese, right? Recently I wrote a couple of things for Sudanese online, and a couple of, like what we call bayan, which is a public statement that a few people signed declaring a position. And we try to argue that I think that we really need to have, there is need for such a change in our attitudes and political behavior, no matter what the nature of the regime is. So overthrowing this regime in Sudan now, without having thought through what would be the alternative and changing our attitudes about political choices we make and how we vote and so on, and especially the question of Sharia and the state, Sharia and politics, a change of regime is not going to mean much, and soon we'll be back to the same. We have been through this already 3 times. And so I say that really for me the change is in thinking differently about what is already there. Meaning we don't have to immediately repeal every law this regime has brought in, for the last 25 years, but just simply start thinking differently about it. That it is not Sharia, it is just simply secular law. And the question about changing our mind about it, I mean, we can change it or not because we think it's good or bad, regardless of the fact that who brought it and what they called it. I think that what we lack and what we are learning is really fundamental notions of accountability, of transparency, of voting on issues, not on personalities, so that, and also being honest about. So if we have not changed, I mean, we are lax, we are disorganized, we are indisciplined, we are, as individual persons, we come late to appointments, we don't do the work we're supposed to do, we just waste time chatting and reading newspapers in the office. All of this is happening. How do we expect political change to happen if we have not changed enough to make it happen? But that change is not going to happen all at once, I suppose, either. So, okay, so if what I'm thinking is, or rather what I'm dreaming, is that, which is already happening, that people get so disillusioned with the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan and places like Sudan, and start seriously looking for alternatives. That alternative will include concerns about Islam and Sharia and the relationship to the state. That this book or this work will provide an understanding of how those choices can be made, that we don't have to opt for an Islamist solution because there is no such thing as an Islamist solution. But still the quest for transformative democratic work has to be done on the ground, organizing our political parties. Our political parties are not democratic. How can we expect them to bring the democracy as a system of governance to the country when they themselves are not democratic? They don't have, internal structures of accountability, of sharing of power. They are sexist. They are racist inside the organization. And so how can we talk about human rights and human rights values? Where are they going to come from? Until, gender relations and gender roles in the home have been transformed by a consciousness of equality and human dignity for men and women equally, I don't think that outside things are going to change that far. But at the same time, I think also I shouldn't sound too pessimistic because there are significant changes in people's attitudes and understanding and so on, except that just a little more of this accountability and transparency that we should seek to bring to our personal lives. And from that it will follow to our institutional and political life outside.
So would education be the first area to sort of...
It depends what you mean by education. Because formal education is extremely important, but the content of that education can be totally uneducating. And I think that for the last 20 years, we have had almost education in the wrong direction completely. So we have been uneducating our children rather than educating them.
Yeah, so I mean like a reform in education.
But where is that reform going to come from? Who are the people who are going to implement it? And because if the problem is that we have to do so much so fast that we can't do it through the normal channels of... So yes, by all means we can start reforming educational institutions, but I think the extra educational or the work that need to be done through cultural activities, through radio, through television, is more important in giving us like a fast track to the type of transformation that we need to have. But it's again, how there's again the notion of that regression is part of progression. That we can't expect to go forward all the time without some setbacks. If we think of the setback as part of the going forward, not as something that is counter to that. Therefore, working with the South, working with various other regions, honestly, since you are from Sudan, you know, there is very deep racism, which people, I'm really shocked and sad to see, even now as we speak. You hear conversations between people and you see these racist stereotyping and sexist stereotyping. So all of that is there. So there is a lot for everyone to do, I say, basically. And I think...
Any other questions from the group? I encourage you to ask questions. I have my questions, but I can probably...
You are holding back.
Sorry.
kind of going back to the separation of politics and the state, and your notion that religion and politics should be together. If you put that with almost an assumption right now of the European democratic paradigm within the Islamic world, politics, the winning politics becomes the state. So you have politics in democracies. You have an election, depending on how you define democracy. But then the winner of that political election turns into the state. So I guess in my mind here in the United States, we have checks based on a constitution that says whether you run politically on a religious platform or not, you're not allowed to use that religion on all of the people. But how would you reconcile religion and politics, and then, again, working within the European paradigm, politics becoming the state?
Of course, I mean, that struggle is still ongoing in this country, and in every other country that is presumably where people have a religious following, a religious affiliation of some sort. One correction I would make, I make a distinction between the state and government. So when you say people vote and that becomes a state, they do not become the state, they become the government. And governments change, whereas there is, so to me there is institutional continuity in the state, and there is political contingency in government. Governments are elected to implement certain policies through state institutions. But in a successful democratic European paradigm, as you put it, when you have a change of government, the new government should be able to use state institutions to implement the new policies for which the new government was elected. And then when you have another change of government, the next government also should be able to use the same state institution. That is why it's important to keep the state institutions neutral, so that they can service different governments with different political agendas. And that's how it's supposed to work. And there's an example that I often use to clarify this point, because some of you may already remember this, but at least it's not that far back, that Gonzalez, who was the Justice, Attorney General for the Bush administration, there were many things that he and others were doing at the time which were totally crazy and were really highly ideological and driven by Bush agenda, which were violent and oppressive and everything else. But it was politics. That they were implementing the politics for which Bush was elected, if he was elected. And what we do is that we wait for the next round and we elect a different president who will do different things, hopefully. But then there was something that Gonzalez did that overstepped the line between politics and the state, which is he fired state prosecutor, federal prosecutors, or federal, officers, judicial officers in certain states, because they were not servicing the political interests of the Republican Party in those states. On that question, he was forced to resign, because that action compromised the neutrality of the Justice Department as a state institution, as opposed to working with it as a state institution to advance policies for which he was elected. So other things that he was doing were within that distinction between what is political and what is a state institution, but on that one he crossed the line, and for that he was forced to resign. So that is the distinction I make. So remember when I said the state is a limited part of an institution, extremely important but limited, in that there is a lot that we need to do to make sure that the state is not hijacked by political agenda. of religious groups. And that's where we need to make the transformation in people's attitudes. And it's not religion per se that's the problem. It's what they understand religion to mean and what seem to follow from it. So if we are willing to engage in the struggles that will transform people's understanding of religion, then their input in the political process will be informed by a more enlightened understanding of religion than it might be otherwise.
I think a lot of, I'm very grateful to all of you who stayed. And I want to thank Professor Fahmy for bringing the class here, but it's also very grateful too for braving this weather. So as a reward, please take all the cookies there on your way out. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.